After class, she whispered, "I grade more than papers." And just like that, everything I thought I knew about her and myself changed. The semester had started like any other, but from the moment I walked into her classroom, I felt something subtle yet undeniable stirring in the air. She was already there, arranging papers neatly on her desk, her movements deliberate and graceful, the kind of quiet confidence that made the room seem warmer just by her presence. At 42, she carried herself with an effortless poise that drew eyes, not in a showy way, but in the way sunlight catches on a still pond. Her hair, a rich chestnut, brushed her shoulders softly as she bent to collect scattered notes, and I couldn't help but notice the faint floral scent that followed her every step. I had always admired her professionalism from a distance, respecting the way she spoke with clarity and patience. But today, as I passed her desk with my own stack of papers, something about the subtle tilt of her head, the gentle brush of her hand against the papers, made my chest tighten slightly. It wasn't just attraction. It was a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and an inexplicable warmth I couldn't name. The classroom itself felt alive with a quiet energy. The faint scratch of pens on notebooks, the soft murmur of students discussing assignments, the distant hum of the air conditioner. All of it became a backdrop to the tiny, almost imperceptible moments that tethered me to her presence. When she looked up and our eyes met for a split second, the room seemed to shrink, the background noise fading into a gentle hum. Her gaze held something steady and knowing, a warmth that made me aware of how out of place I sometimes felt in my own skin. As the lecture began, I tried to focus on the material, but every movement of hers, straightening a stack of books, adjusting her glasses, pausing to listen to a question, felt magnified. I noticed how her lips curved slightly when she explained a complex topic, the way her shoulders relaxed when she nodded in acknowledgement of a student's response. Each small gesture told me more about her than words ever could, and I found myself appreciating the quiet rhythm of her presence. Calm, composed, yet subtly inviting. By the end of class, she called me over to collect my assignment. Her hand brushed mine as she took the papers, a contact so brief it could be dismissed, yet long enough to make my heartbeat quicken. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that lingered in my memory as I left the room. It wasn't flirtation, exactly. At least, not in the conventional sense. But there was a spark there, a quiet acknowledgement of something unsaid, something that set the stage for what I knew would be a semester unlike any other. That ordinary day, which might have seemed mundane to anyone else, became the beginning of a slow, unspoken connection. A glance, a brush of a hand, a momentary smile, all ordinary gestures with extraordinary weight. And as I walked out of the classroom, the memory of her presence stayed with me, settling into my mind like a gentle flame, promising that this semester would awaken something in me I hadn't expected, and perhaps something in her as well. The next few days passed with the usual rhythm of classes, yet I found myself constantly noticing her in moments that felt ordinary but carried a subtle, unspoken warmth. It wasn't just in the lecture hall anymore. It was in the way she moved through the campus, the library, even the quiet hallway outside her office. Every small interaction between us became a thread connecting our worlds, though neither of us spoke aloud, the curiosity growing beneath the surface. One afternoon, I stayed behind after class to ask a question about an assignment. She looked up from the stack of papers on her desk, her eyes soft but attentive. The sunlight streamed in through the window, catching the strands of hair that had fallen slightly out of place as she leaned over her notes. She reached for a textbook on the edge of the desk, and as her hand brushed mine, it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. That brief contact sent a warmth up my arm and left me acutely aware of her presence. Yet it remained perfectly innocent, an everyday gesture that carried the faintest spark. We started to share small, quiet moments beyond class. In the library, our fingers occasionally brushed over the same reference book, or our knees touched as we both sat on the same bench, absorbed in our respective work. There was a rhythm to these encounters, a gentle ebb and flow of presence and attention that felt both comforting and charged with unspoken possibility. I began noticing the little things. The soft tilt of her head when she smiled, The subtle way her lips parted as she explained a concept, or the warmth in her voice when she paused to encourage a student. One day, as we walked down a corridor lined with tall oak doors, she reached out to steady a stack of papers I was juggling. Her hand pressed lightly against mine, not in urgency, but in a casual, deliberate way that made my pulse quicken. I looked at her, meeting her gaze for a fraction of a heartbeat, and saw something in her eyes, a quiet curiosity, a hint of recognition of the small connection forming between us. Even the simple act of talking became charged with intimacy. Her voice had a warmth that drew me in, a rhythm that made me hang on to every word. When she laughed softly at something I said, it wasn't loud or theatrical, but a delicate melody that lingered in the air long after the sound had faded. I caught myself stealing glances, noticing how her hand grazed the edge of a notebook, or how she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, gestures that seemed to reveal a side of her few people ever saw. By the end of the week, the innocence of our interactions had subtly shifted. There was a comfort in being near her, a quiet tension that neither of us acknowledged aloud, but one that made my stomach flutter with a mix of anticipation and admiration. It was a slow, deliberate dance of proximity and distance. Her presence, her gestures, and the warmth of her attention building a connection that felt effortless yet charged with emotion. And so, in these ordinary moments, the brush of a hand, the shared laughter, the soft glances across the library, an invisible thread formed between us, one that hinted at something deeper, something waiting patiently to unfold in the days and nights to come. It was during one of those routine visits to her office that I first noticed the subtle shift between us. The office was quiet, the soft hum of the overhead light blending with the distant sounds of students in the hallway. She had asked me to come by to discuss a paper, but the moment I stepped inside, the ordinary task felt different, charged with a kind of quiet electricity I hadn't expected. She gestured for me to sit across from her, her chair slightly angled, bringing our knees closer than necessary. The air seemed to thicken, carrying the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the crisp aroma of freshly printed papers. I tried to focus on the assignment, on the words written in neat paragraphs, but her presence made it nearly impossible. Her fingers lingered on the edge of my paper as she pointed out a small note, the touch light but deliberate. My pulse quickened at the contact, not in panic, but in a strange, magnetic awareness of her closeness. We spoke quietly, the conversation drifting from academic details to small, personal observations. A casual remark about a favorite book, a shared smile over a common memory. These small moments felt disproportionately intimate in the private space of her office. I noticed the way her eyes softened when she laughed, how her shoulders relaxed when she leaned slightly forward, as if inviting me into her space without words. The subtlety of it made every gesture feel weighty, like a secret language spoken only between the two of us. There was a moment, a pause between sentences, when she leaned back and looked at me with a gaze that felt simultaneously curious and tender. The silence stretched just long enough for me to feel every detail. The warmth radiating from her, the faint brush of air as she shifted in her chair, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. I realized then that this was more than admiration or casual attention. There was an unspoken tension hovering between us, delicate and electric. Her words were careful, almost teasing. When she whispered, "I grade more than papers." It was light, playful, and completely appropriate on the surface. But the cadence, the pause, the softness of her tone made it intimate in a way that reverberated through my chest. It wasn't overt, it wasn't daring, but it left an impression that lingered, a quiet suggestion of depth behind the words. My mind raced to interpret the meaning, to gauge the weight behind her glance, her tone, her body language, but it was impossible to pin down, and perhaps that was the point. I left her office that day feeling both exhilarated and unsettled. Every step back to the hallway was heavy with thought, my senses replaying the gentle brush of her fingers, the softness of her voice, the warmth that seemed to linger in the air long after I left. The boundary between student and professor felt both rigid and yet somehow porous, and I became acutely aware of every interaction we would have moving forward. It was the beginning of a new dynamic, a tension neither of us fully acknowledged aloud, yet one that would color every moment we spent together. The spark was no longer innocent admiration. It had grown into a quiet, deliberate awareness, a slow-burning connection that neither of us could ignore. And as I walked back to my dorm, I knew that everything had changed, even if only subtly, and that the next encounter would carry the weight of all the unspoken things hanging between us. After that brief, electrifying moment in her office, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of emotions I didn't fully understand. Every time I thought about her, the subtle warmth of her hand on mine or the gentle teasing in her voice returned vividly, like a quiet echo I couldn't shake. And yet, along with the exhilaration came hesitation, a gnawing awareness of boundaries I couldn't ignore. She was my professor, significantly older, and respected by everyone in the department. My admiration, once purely academic, now wrestled with feelings I felt I shouldn't have. Walking across campus, I noticed her in small, ordinary ways that seemed suddenly magnified. The way she adjusted her scarf in the morning sun, the gentle arch of her eyebrows when she read through her notes, the sound of her soft laughter drifting through the hallway. It all seemed to tug at something inside me. My mind played over the moments in her office. The lingering glance, the subtle brush of skin, the cadence of her voice. Each memory made my chest tighten with a blend of excitement and guilt, and I realized that I was no longer viewing our interactions as purely professional. I struggled internally with what these feelings meant. Was it natural to feel drawn to someone so poised, so kind, so quietly magnetic? Or was it an infatuation that should be quelled before it grew? I reminded myself of the boundaries. Student, teacher, professionalism. But those words felt heavy against the pull of curiosity and something more intangible that simmered beneath the surface. At the same time, I noticed signs that suggested she might be aware of the tension too. Subtle gestures, the way her eyes lingered just a beat too long, the softness in her smile when I handed over papers, the gentle inclination of her head when we spoke, hinted at something unspoken. And yet, nothing overt, nothing crossing the line. It was a delicate dance, an intricate balance of proximity and restraint, and I found myself both captivated and cautious. Even in the quiet of my own thoughts, I couldn't ignore the emotional conflict. Part of me wanted to seek more conversation, more moments, more connection, but another part hesitated, fearful of misinterpreting signals, fearful of compromising her position or mine. I began to notice how my heart responded to even the smallest interactions. A brush of her hand on mine, a casual touch on the shoulder, a shared smile across the classroom. It was intoxicating, yet it carried the weight of something forbidden, something that required restraint. In those days, every encounter became a study in awareness and self-control. I became hyper-conscious of my own reactions, analyzing her tone, her gestures, her expressions, searching for meaning without overstepping. The tension between desire and propriety shaped my every thought, turning even the most mundane classroom interactions into moments charged with possibility and hesitation. By the end of this period, I understood that our connection had shifted subtly but irrevocably. The spark in the office was no longer a fleeting moment. It had begun to embed itself into the rhythm of our daily interactions. And with that realization came the quiet acknowledgement that the slow burn of attraction was no longer just a personal distraction. It was becoming something real, something worth observing, feeling, and navigating with care. The rain came softly that afternoon, tapping against the windows of the quiet campus library. Most students had already left, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet stone and paper. I had lingered to review some notes when I noticed her entering, her coat glistening with raindrops, hair slightly damp at the ends. She offered a small, almost shy smile, and in that moment, the weight of distance and propriety softened just enough for something personal to seep through. She moved to the same table where I sat, sliding in across from me, a casual proximity that sent a subtle warmth through my chest. Our conversation began as it always did: books, papers, academic matters. But there was a gentleness in her voice, a willingness to share beyond the classroom that felt intimate yet entirely safe. She spoke of her favorite novels as a child, of moments in life that had shaped her patience and resilience, of small disappointments and quiet triumphs. With every word, I sensed layers of her I hadn't seen before. A depth beyond her polished exterior, a vulnerability that invited me closer. At some point, a misplaced pen rolled across the table. I instinctively reached to pick it up, and our hands brushed lightly. The touch was fleeting, yet it lingered in my mind far longer than the moment itself. I noticed the warmth of her hand, the softness of her skin against mine, and the way her gaze met mine with a quiet steadiness that made it impossible to look away. There was a weight to the silence that followed, comfortable, tender, yet charged with unspoken understanding. As the rain continued outside, we shared little confessions. My nervousness about a presentation, her candid admission that she sometimes felt the isolation of being constantly in control. Our voices dropped lower, unconsciously matching the intimacy of the empty room. I realized that this was the first time I saw her as more than my teacher, more than a figure of authority. She was a human being with fears, dreams, and small moments of hesitation, just like me. There was a delicate closeness in our shared space. Our knees brushed under the table, subtle shifts bringing us nearer without deliberate intent. Every glance, every quiet laugh, felt magnified in the emptiness of the library, resonating with the unspoken connection we were building. I noticed how her hair occasionally fell over her face, and when she tucked it behind her ear, our fingers brushed again. A fleeting, casual intimacy that seemed to say, without words, "I trust you." By the time the rain slowed, the world outside had transformed. The campus paths gleamed with reflections, the air smelled of fresh earth, and the library felt suspended in its own private time. I left with a lingering warmth, my thoughts replaying every glance, every touch, every soft-spoken word. It wasn't passion or desire in a physical sense. It was a deep, quiet intimacy, a connection that settled in my chest and refused to leave. In that simple, rain-soaked afternoon, I realized our bond was no longer just academic. We had ventured into a space of emotional closeness, a slow unveiling of trust and vulnerability. The spark that had begun with glances and gestures now glowed steadily, subtle but undeniable. A shared understanding that, though unspoken, neither of us could ignore. It was late in the afternoon when I found myself once again in her office, the room bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the blinds. Papers were scattered across the desk, but the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the two of us in a quiet cocoon of suspended time. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, mingling with the crisp scent of freshly printed notes. Every sound, the gentle tick of the wall clock, the soft scratch of pen on paper, seemed amplified, emphasizing the closeness between us. She had called me in to help review an assignment, a mundane task on the surface, yet the rhythm of our interaction made the moment feel charged. Her chair creaked slightly as she leaned over a stack of papers, bringing our shoulders near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. I kept my focus on the work, yet every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the way her fingers traced a margin, the gentle brush of her wrist against mine, made my attention fracture, pulling me into the unspoken space between us. We laughed softly over a shared misunderstanding in the notes, and our eyes met, holding each other just a beat longer than necessary. That pause, the silent acknowledgement of our connection, was weighted with possibility. I noticed the way her hand rested lightly on the edge of my paper, her fingers brushing against mine in a touch that was deliberate, yet innocent, and it sent a quiet thrill through me. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken, to make the hum of the office feel like a private universe where nothing else existed. She leaned back slightly, her gaze locking with mine. For a moment, the professional boundary that had governed our interactions wavered. There was a stillness in her expression, a subtle vulnerability hidden beneath her confident exterior. I realized she was aware of the tension, just as I was, and that mutual recognition made every heartbeat louder, every glance more significant. At one point, our hands touched again, not by accident, but in a shared, deliberate motion while arranging papers. The contact was fleeting, yet it carried the weight of everything unsaid between us. Her proximity, the warmth of her skin near mine, and the gentle cadence of her voice discussing the assignment were enough to create a heady sense of intimacy. My mind registered the moment, yet my body and heart felt it fully, a careful, YouTube-safe connection that said more than words could. Finally, she stood and walked toward the door, pausing just long enough for our eyes to meet. The soft click of the lock echoed as she closed it gently behind us, a gesture that transformed the ordinary office into a space heavy with emotional resonance. There was no rush, no overt declaration, just the quiet acknowledgement that something significant had shifted between us. The tension, previously simmering beneath layers of professionalism, had reached a peak, leaving us both aware of the depth of our connection. As I stepped back into the hallway, I carried with me the memory of her gaze, the warmth of her hand, and the subtle but undeniable closeness that had formed. It wasn't just attraction. It was trust, recognition, and an intimacy that had grown patiently over weeks. The slow burn, finally ignited, promised a bond that neither of us could ignore, setting the stage for the final chapter of understanding and emotional fulfillment. The semester had passed in a blur of shared moments, each one carefully layered with quiet smiles, lingering glances, and subtle touches that had grown into something undeniably profound. By the time the final weeks arrived, the tension that had built over countless lectures, library sessions, and office visits had softened into a comforting, warm understanding. It was no longer about forbidden attraction or the thrill of uncertainty. It was about connection, trust, and the quiet joy of being seen by someone who mattered deeply. That afternoon, the campus was painted in golden sunlight. I found her walking along the tree-lined path toward the library, her coat draped over her shoulders, hair catching the light in gentle waves. When she noticed me, her smile carried a calm certainty, a reassurance that felt like the gentle exhale after weeks of held breaths. I waved, and she motioned me closer, a gesture as simple as it was intimate. As we walked side by side, our conversation was light yet meaningful. We reflected on the past months, the challenges of coursework, shared laughs over small academic mishaps, and moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but had quietly built a foundation of trust between us. Her presence felt like sunlight on my skin, steady and grounding, and I became acutely aware of the rhythm of our steps, the subtle brushing of our arms, and the warmth that came from simply being near her. We paused on a quiet bench beneath the shade of a sprawling oak. The gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of campus life became the backdrop to a moment of unspoken understanding. She looked at me with a softness that made my chest tighten. Not in anxiety, but in a deep, steadying affection. Without needing words, I felt the culmination of weeks of small gestures, glances, and shared vulnerabilities. It was a connection that didn't require grand declarations. It thrived in quiet acknowledgement and mutual respect. She reached out, lightly brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. The touch was brief, tender, and deliberate, conveying more than any spoken phrase could. My hand hovered near hers, hesitating for a moment before finding hers in a gentle clasp. The warmth of her skin, the soft pressure of her fingers intertwined with mine, and the steadiness of her gaze made the world feel smaller, calmer, and infinitely more intimate. It was a touch that said, "I see you, I trust you, we are here together." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the path, we lingered in that moment, content in our quiet companionship. There were no rushed words, no need for declarations that might disrupt the delicate balance we had nurtured. Instead, there was a profound understanding that the slow burn had matured into something enduring, a relationship built on patience, empathy, and deep emotional intimacy. As I walked home later, the memory of her hand in mine, the curve of her smile, and the gentle cadence of her laughter remained with me. The story that began with glances and subtle touches had blossomed into a meaningful, warm connection, one that respected boundaries, honored feelings, and embraced the beauty of emotional closeness. And in that realization, I knew that this was a beginning, not an ending, a relationship defined not by urgency or drama, but by the steady, comforting flame of trust, affection, and quiet love. If you felt the slow burn of their connection, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that will make your heart race and your soul warm. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a connection that felt just as impossible yet unforgettable? 14.